How many times have we heard speakers say, Canada is a forest nation? We've heard politicians say it. We've heard it from forest company executives, by academics, spokesmen for industry, and by union leaders. And in just about every case, it's been followed by an impressive citing of facts and figures that demonstrate just how dependent we are upon the forest resource. The speakers dwell upon the number of jobs created directly and indirectly by the forest industry. They note that forest products are important earners of foreign exchange, and they compare the employment and export significance of the forest with the contributions made by other economic sectors, such as agriculture, fisheries, and mining, with forestry always emerging as the clear leader. And so it should. There is no argument with the facts. Economically, we are indeed a forest nation. But there is an argument, a very important argument that can be made against the attitude behind those economic facts. And the time has come for that argument to be made. To reduce it to a phrase, too many of us can't see the forest for the timber. We have encountered the forest in all its size and complexity, but we've only experienced it as a resource to be cut, processed, and sold to provide revenues and jobs. We've not admitted that the value of the forest is more than the worth of its merchantable timber. Instead, we've preferred to see the forest as a static thing. But the process goes on, and we're now reaching the point where the reality of the forest as a continuing process is breaking through our perception of the forest as a static thing. We have been the heirs to a great fortune, which had been deposited for us in a bank account before any of us were born. But ever since we got our hands on the passbook, we've been drawing heavily from the account while relatively putting back only pennies. Now we see that the balance of the account is shrinking. We see that the day is not far off that most of the inheritance will be gone. The future balance will depend on how well we manage and reinvest in our forest resources. From here on, it's up to us. But before we can begin managing our remaining inheritance, we must understand what it truly is. It's not enough to say that we are a forest nation and mean only that we are harvesters and sellers of wood. We should look back to when Solomon wanted cedar for his new temple in Jerusalem, and he sent to Lebanon, a land covered in giant cedars. Today, the hills of Lebanon grow little but dry grass. The trees are gone, along with all the creatures that lived beneath them. Lebanon was a forest nation, as were many of the biblical kingdoms around the ancient Fertile Crescent, but they're not forest nations anymore. They spent what they had inherited without putting anything back. But we're more fortunate than those ancient peoples because we have their examples to learn from. We can now see how we've denied the process and have begun, through a major reinvestment program, to make amends, and we're expanding our frame of reference. Since it would do us little good to see the forest as a process if we limit our perception only to the dynamics of harvesting wood for sale. The forest is more than a source of raw material for a major industry, and the people of a forest nation must be more than just workers or managers in that industry. The forest means jobs and revenues in the forest industry, but it goes beyond such simple economics. It also means jobs and revenues in the tourism industry, clean water for our citizens to drink, and habitat for our wildlife. Those who are in the forest sector often can't see the forest for the timber and have a hard time understanding how the idea of thousands of square kilometers of forest works upon the mind of a visitor from Britain or Japan. What they call a forest in their part of the world, we would call a postage stamp-sized park. To them, the prospect of standing on a mountaintop and seeing a forest that goes on forever is something from a fantasy world. For people who live in crowded cities and tame landscapes, the reality of a land where they could walk for days in any direction, seeing nothing but trees and wildlife, has an almost magical appeal. And that's why so many of them come here. They don't come to see our mills and our factories. They come to see something they can't see at home. They come to see our forests. But foreigners aren't the only people who want to experience our forests. Canadians in the woods outnumber all the foreign tourists combined. Even for the most completely urbanized Canadian, snug in a downtown condo, the forest is an ever-present backdrop, an essential part of their environment. If there's such a thing as a Canadian identity, then the forest is an indispensable part of it. Not the forest that we harvest, but the forest where we hiked and camped, where we saw the moose or fished a quiet stream, where we felt somehow distinctly Canadian. Sure, it's a romantic view, and far removed from a purely economic appreciation of the forest resource. But it's a widely held view among Canadians, and it's no less real than the figures on a balance sheet or in a resource use forecast. If we are to see the forests for what they are, then we must be able to accommodate some romantic notions in our planning. Yes, the forest must provide jobs for Canadians, earnings for the industry, and revenues for government. But it must also provide the raw material for tourism and recreation, and it must play its part in supporting our identity as citizens of a forest nation. And of course, the forest must be able to do the job nature gave it, creating and sustaining the natural environment in which we all live. We can't afford to forget that the forest is the basis of an immensely complex ecology. If we ask, what would Canada be without the forest, we must also ask, what would Canada be without the forest environment? We've taken our forest for granted. We've treated the forest as a limitless, expanding frontier. But now, the limits are in sight. The frontier has ceased to expand on its own. From here on in, we must grow the forest, and we must tend it well. The forest we will have in the future will depend on what we do now. The existing resource is fully committed, so we can't expand the annual allowable cut without significantly increasing our level of management. We must manage the forest. That is now clear. But manage it for what purpose? The demands upon forest land are not just for wood supply. There's a demand for scenery, wildlife habitat, farmland, parkland, hydro reservoirs, and clean drinking water. How do we accommodate all these different and conflicting demands upon the land base? History doesn't offer much guidance. In the past, there was always plenty of forest land. As much as was needed could be set aside for parks, for wildlife preserves, for watershed, and still leave plenty of trees to log. Should we divide the total forest land base into a patchwork quilt with separate patches for separate uses? Unfortunately, there's not enough land for every user to have their very own portion. As it is, over the last few years, different users have found themselves rubbing shoulders more often than they like. And today, rubbing shoulders has progressed to butting heads. We are now into the era of land use conflicts. Any stretch of forest land may be at stake in a confrontation. There is a limit to how many times we can divide the patches on the quilt. There's not enough land to give every interest the exclusive use to as much forest land as each would like. So what do we do? The simplest solution is to rank the different uses in terms of priority and assign forest land on that basis. But that only guarantees continuing confrontation. We must see the forest as an integrated, renewable resource. We must manage it for integrated uses, and we must ensure that today's use does not needlessly close out other uses which may become desirable 10, 20, or 50 years from now. Today, the forest land base must be judged in terms of the total value of the land in question, not only the worth of its timber, but also of its other assets. With this approach, the cost-benefit analysis of the forest land ceases to be a simple matter of the value of timber and the cost of extracting it. Resource use analysis becomes a more sophisticated exercise, covering a matrix of apparent and hidden values, and reflecting the true complexity of the seemingly simple question, what should we do with the forest land base? It puts a new responsibility upon the forestry professional. A forester is expected to know about trees and about the economics of the forest sector. But he's not a specialist in agriculture, in hydroengineering, in wildlife biology, or in any of the other dozen or so disciplines that may apply in integrated use resource management. If we are to move toward a multidisciplinary approach to managing the forest resource, the knowledge and capabilities of other people must be brought into the decision-making. Broadening the flow of advice is perhaps the easiest step in fostering a new appreciation of the forest. A more difficult task will be to bring into harmony the interests that now compete, often very bitterly, for the use of forest land. Partially, it's a question of public awareness. In recent years, the forest sector has worked to increase public understanding of its needs and constraints. But perhaps we haven't worked quite so hard at appreciating the views and wishes, romantic as they may sometimes be, of the ordinary Canadian. We'll all have to work very hard to bring about the key prerequisite for any kind of workable integrated use forest management policy. That prerequisite is mutual trust among the competing interests. We must create a climate of mutual confidence between labor and management, between industry and environmentalists, and between the resource user and the resource regulator. We must find some way to work with each other. We can begin by trying to see the situation from each other's point of view and accepting the fact that none of us has all the answers. The industry will sometimes have to accept that the best use for a particular piece of forest land may not be the production of pulp or dimension lumber, while the environmentalists may have to concede that sometimes the best thing to do with a stand of trees is to log it and let new growth come up in its place. We need to explore the potential for the integrated use of forest land and look for ways to stop butting our heads together. But ultimately, trust is earned by performance. Each of us must show that we are worthy of confidence and allow others to demonstrate that they too can be trusted. We need to find common ground and to establish a set of broad, common objectives on which all potential users can agree. We must ask ourselves what the forest means to us as Canadians. We must ask ourselves what the forest is to be used for, who is to use it, and how it may best be used. Until now, history and geography have combined to let us postpone the answers to those questions, but we can't put them off much longer. We must design strategies now for the forest of the future that recognize the forest as a dynamic process and that accommodate the wishes and goals of all who have a stake in the forest resource, both now and in the future. It will be a difficult task. But if we want Canadians to be able to say, 50 years from now, that we are a forest nation, then we'd better shed our old ways of looking at the forest and get to work, because there is no alternative.